Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And I hope that wherever you are, you're having a wonderful day or evening or night, whatever it may be. Since I do know that we have people watching from a variety of time zones. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your question or comment directly onto whatever platform you're watching on. And assuming you're watching live, it will show up here in our chat room. And we can communicate directly that way. And today, our subject matter uh, is the vampire, both vampire mythos and contemporary reality. And I'm going to start by saying again today what I said yesterday, and hello to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. Which is that, and hello to Mary in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. Um, and hello to Reverend Mary in the chat room, and she has her garlic ready. Um, some of these subjects I'm going to talk about this week may tend to overlap each other a little bit, and half an hour, we can only get so far on a very deep subject. I did not nearly get as far with werewolves yesterday as I would have liked to. I'm certain that will probably happen today with vampires also. There's just so much to discuss about it. But I'm going to start the discussion with something that came up yesterday, and that is the idea of highly personal understandings of these various um, items from folklore. And hello to Jade in the chat room. It's good to see you, Jade. Yesterday, we had someone in the chat room by the name of Jeremiah, who hopefully will come again today, who had a very personal understanding of the subject of werewolves. And, I've been thinking about that since the conversation. And the first thing I want to say about that is there's nothing at all wrong with having a very personal understanding of these subjects, even when it totally differs from everything else. And hello to Antonio in the chat room. Hello to Victoria in the chat room. It's good to see you both. Um, it is, part of the spiritual path to find things out for yourself and see how they work for you. So, although I would not objectively agree with some of the things that Jeremiah was saying, that doesn't necessarily mean I think they're wrong either. Um, I would say that historically, they're not what I see evidence of. Um, but it wouldn't be the first time that someone found things out historically through psychic means. And hello to Renee in the chat room. And I thought I would illustrate this very quickly with one of my favorite stories that you've probably heard many times already if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, but it's the story of the gentle goddess Ariana. And chances are, if you are a student of mythology, your first question to that is, what gentle goddess Ariana? There have been some goddesses named Ariana. The wife of Bacchus was Ariana, who was a reflex of Ariadne. But the character of the gentle goddess Ariana, who was associated with the greater goddess Dithina, was entirely a personal mythos of a particular person. And this person's name was John Closby. I had the great pleasure of knowing John many years ago in the Fellowship of Isis in Chicago. And John was convinced that he was the living physical avatar of the gentle maiden goddess Ariana. And he had a huge backstory for this, involving many other deities that were not part of the normal human experience. And when I first heard this, I what can I say? It just seemed like a total fantasy. But then I found out more about this backstory, and it turned out that some years before John had been in an identity crisis about whether he was or was not the avatar of this goddess, and he prayed to her. And he prayed, "Gentle goddess Ariana, if I am truly your avatar, give me a sign." And pretty much right after that, he won $80 million in the lotto. That is a sign. That is possibly the most overwhelming sign that I can think of that I know to be absolutely true. And once I found that out, my attitude became, well, I wouldn't have thought that this man who is most visibly reminiscent of Mr. Magoo, for those of you old enough to remember who Mr. Magoo is, could possibly be the living avatar of an otherwise unknown goddess, but that's pretty convincing. And since then, my attitude has been that there's more in the universe than we realize. So, if you have a highly personal understanding of one of these things that doesn't mesh with everyone else's, that doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong. I'm not entirely sure what in some cases it does mean, um, but it's something to bear in mind. And as you go through life and as you learn different things, you want to remember that sometimes what doesn't seem likely may turn out to have more in it than there appears to be. Now, having said all of that, I'm sure there's also more than one way of interpreting the story of John and the Gentle Goddess. Um, but like I say, it seemed like a pretty convincing sign to me. And thereafter, I really didn't question his identity as an avatar of that deity. Now, today, having discussed that, we're going to discuss vampires, but this is relevant to that subject because a lot of people do have that kind of very personal, very idiosyncratic relationship to the mythos of the vampire. And hopefully, we're going to have enough time to get to that part of this conversation. It may overlap into our conversation on zombies on Thursday. We'll have to see how it goes. Um, but I wanted to start first with the idea of the historical vampire. And again, the vampires that we think of today are strongly influenced by Hollywood images, not least by Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula in the famous film from 1931, I believe, which is a great film for its time, uh, and certainly created a very lasting impression of what to expect from a vampire. Um, and that impression had first been created on the stage, and it was built out of a literary tradition going back about 100 years previously, back to the Regency era. And this basically is the idea of the vampire as an immortal, compelling, charismatic figure, which maintains its immortality through the consumption of blood. And in the 19th century, the various literary vampires sometimes conformed to this, sometimes did not. But in the 20th century, they pretty much universally do. In the 19th century, there were still some more traditional attitudes toward vampires that you would see in vampire literature. The original novel Dracula by Bram Stoker actually, in some ways, carries this forward because we think of Bela Lugosi or Gary Oldman as Dracula, but Nosferatu is much closer to the character that's actually in the story, which is more of a traditional visual for a vampire. So let's talk a little bit about those traditional vampires. The idea of vampirism as a spirit goes back well into antiquity and is found pretty much all over the world. The idea that there are certain spirits who serve who sustain themselves by consuming the vitality of living people and presumably other things, which in part is based on, and hello to Victoria in the chat room, in part is based on the fact that there are animals that do this. But throughout antiquity and through most of the world, these were not necessarily thought of as human entities. They were spirits. In Greece, for example, you have the Lamia. You have various similar figures. And most commonly, they consumed the energy of the living. And they were associated with things like wasting diseases and the like. And that connection between the vampire and disease made it pretty much until the modern era, because if you go back and look at Nosferatu, that aspect of the vampire and plague is part of that film, even if it's rather understated. But in a lot of ways, they were, for want of a better way to put it, spirits of illness, as people thought of them. It's at a later point that they come to be associated with human beings. And it's possible, because that's much more of a European association, that it had been older there and simply is not recorded because so many things from Europe in antiquity are not recorded in words. Um, but certainly by the Middle Ages, you're seeing the modern idea of the vampire as a revived corpse present throughout Europe. And this is different from those older ideas of vampiric entities, even though there's often a connection. And in that era, basically from the late Dark Ages up until up until the 19th century, there were a variety of understandings of this. Some people felt that vampires um, were not associated with the living person, but were spirits that took over a vacated body after the person died. Some people definitely did feel that they were associated with the living person and that a person who had lived a bad life might become a vampire after death. Um, some people felt that this had a very strong religious connotation. In Orthodox Christianity, the idea of the vampire um, was connected with anyone who was an opponent of the church. And the idea that they would rise after death to decimate the living was a fairly common thought in those areas. And people reacted to it in a lot of ways, including digging up graves and giving the vampire a second death in a variety of different ways. The stake through the heart is the modern one that we all think of. Historically, a nail through the heart was used by some people. Beheading was very common. Burning the corpse was very common. And there were also a variety of other ways used to contain the corpse of a supposed vampire. But it was something that people in those eras absolutely believed. And one of the things I was talking about with werewolves the other day, I don't know if you can hear them, but the local werewolves are complaining that I've moved on to a new subject. Um, but well, they must have heard me say that because now they're quiet. But if you look at the evidence from the Renaissance of how society treated supposed werewolves, very often they did not believe that anything metaphysical was happening. Sometimes they did, but surprisingly often they did not. They thought they were dealing with a mental illness. That was not the case with vampirism. People absolutely took it seriously. And they took it seriously all the way into the 18th century. And Reverend Mary says, local werewolves. LOL. Yes. Um, I don't know if anyone actually could hear them, but they were howling at the house next door. Um, and there they go again. But um, as I was saying, that the idea of the vampire was taken very seriously, and the statement has been made. I don't remember off the top of my head who said it, but that if the presence of credible eyewitnesses is enough to prove that something is true, then nothing has been more thoroughly proven than the existence of vampires. because there are all kinds of eyewitness accounts, all the way down into the 1700s, uh, verifying that this is absolutely true, at least as people understood it. Um, and what do you make of that? Were they all hallucinating? Were they simply misunderstanding? Well, one of the common theories about this is that when they went to open the graves of supposed vampires, one of the proofs that they were looking for is that the body would be unusually well preserved and full of what appeared to be fresh blood. And having living in the kind of culture where we study these things, we know now that that is a normal part of the decomposition process, which they may not have realized because they usually buried people very quickly. And although they lived much closer to death than we do, butchering their own meat, for example, they didn't necessarily live all that close to decomposition. And they may have misinterpreted what they were seeing when they opened these graves. Um, I'm not personally inclined to think that there was a great infestation of vampires in Europe, at least not in this sense. But I will say that um, I'm not a great one to say that anything is impossible. And that brings us back to where I started our show today. That just because something doesn't necessarily go with what I've experienced or what seems likely doesn't necessarily mean it's impossible. Um, Having said that, doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to accept it either, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. In a lot of cases, um, I withhold judgment. I've seen no reason to think that your traditional mythological vampire, um, in the form of a revived corpse, does or has um, ever existed. However, having said that, I might meet one tomorrow. Who knows? Um, I've certainly met a couple of people over the years who made me wonder. But for the most part, I tend to agree with the theory that those people who felt they were opening the graves of vampires were simply misunderstanding what exactly they were seeing. Um, and what they took to be bodies that had been buried for a while but were full of fresh blood was actually the liquids involved in putrefaction, and it simply gave that impression. Another thing that was connected to the traditional belief in vampires was the prevalence of diseases like tuberculosis, where people basically had long wasting diseases that led to death. And a lot of people in those days attributed that to spiritual vampirism, that they were having their life force slowly sucked out of them. And again, traditionally, when we talk about vampires, the idea that they were sucking the blood out of people was far less common than the idea that they were sucking the life force, the energy, the pranic energy, if you would. And that is more the traditional understanding of vampires. Um, there are also a lot of historic accounts of people who insist that they met vampires and interacted with them. But those accounts also often say that this occurred when they were dreaming, and that's kind of telling, in my opinion. But was it something they believed? Absolutely. Now, in the modern world, in the 19th century, a number of things happened that created our modern idea of the vampire. One of which was the popularity of the anti-hero. The model for the modern vampire is generally thought to be Lord Byron, who also was the model for and the creator of the idea of the anti-hero, um, the eccentric, antisocial, brooding, misunderstood character. And the first vampire novel, if I remember correctly, is Varney the Vampire, written by Dr. Polidori, who is a friend of Byron, and said bluntly that, yeah, this character is Byron. And it's part of that whole summer with Byron and Shelley and Mary Shelley and Polidori at Lake Geneva. And this really kind of set the model for the 19th century idea of vampires, which again is that very charismatic, very eroticized, very he's really all right, he's just misunderstood idea of vampires, which proved to be very compelling to 19th century sensibilities and to 20th century sensibilities. It was also very highly linked to sexuality. And in a lot of cases, the role of the vampire, while not overtly sexual, um, was also a bit of, of a comment on the sexual mores of the time and the idea of the highly polished gentleman seducing the virginal maiden and slowly killing her with his overtures was a very 19th century thing. But even through the early part of the 20th century, this highly sexual dynamic in the vampire mythology was very obvious. And in the latter part of the 20th century, it became quite overt. Um, and the idea of the vampire as a romantic and sexual anti-hero is very much the current idea of the image of the vampire. And this owes itself to a number of things, including the attitude of 19th century people toward the prevailing mores of their society. And the fact that while they were on one hand embracing what would later be called a Victorian attitude, they weren't entirely pleased with that either. And they liked the idea of the misunderstood seducer figure. And it was very attractive to people. And if you look at the classic vampire story up until the 1960s, you have the beautiful maiden, her husband and or boyfriend, who is lantern-jawed, stalwart, and perfectly respectable. And then you have the vampire, who is the bad boy. And it's usually a three-way story between these characters. And it is the idea that what is forbidden is very attractive. And that has a lot to do with modern vampire um, mythology. Another thing that has a lot to do with modern vampire mythology is, and traditional vampire mythology as well, is our unease as mortal beings over the concept of death. And living in the Christian world, which did not have reincarnation for most Christian sects as a major tenet, I think that anxiety was even higher than, say, in antiquity, where reincarnation was a well-known idea, if not always universally accepted. I think this is one of the reasons that you see the idea of the human vampire emerge in the Christian world that you really didn't see in the pagan world. Um, Vampiric entities were regarded as spirits in the pagan world, not as an aspect of mortal existence. But I think that the unease of people regarding the fact that we all do die and their concern with where we go afterwards without that concept of reincarnation is also part of the enduring appeal of this mythos because, of course, at the center is the idea of immortality. Although I am under the impression that was not always an aspect of the vampire mythos, the idea of being resurrected from the grave, yes, but whether it was indefinitely immortal is perhaps a more modern aspect. But it is very much part of the current vampire mythos. And Anne Rice, who has a lot to do with current understandings of vampires as uh, highly eroticized and ultimately desirable beings, was writing her vampire fiction after the early death of her daughter and has said that that issue of death and what comes after death was a lot of the reasons she chose to deal with that genre. And I think it's a lot of what still attracts people to that genre, the idea of living forever. Um, And a little blood is not a high cost for that, I think, in many people's view. And hello to High Priest 012 in the chat room. It's good to see you, High Priest. And these are a number of ideas around the vampire mythos. As I said, the half hour we have is not long enough to do a really in-depth look at it, but these are a number of things that are important. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the contemporary vampire community. And I've waited for the last 5 minutes to do it. But there is very much a contemporary vampire community of people who consider themselves to be vampires, and often play into this mythos very heavily. And I believe it's divided into two camps: sanguine vampires who actually do go around drinking blood um, by consent um, and as part of what they do, and psychic vampires who simply absorb energy. And I've often referred to my favorite vampire author, Michel Belanger, who belongs to that second camp. Um, and I frequently talked about how talking to and listening to Michel helped me to come to a much better understanding of the idea of psychic vampirism. And we've talked about psychic vampirism in other contexts on this program before, but there are certainly people who acknowledge themselves as psychic vampires, live this as a lifestyle, again, taking energy by consent, ideally. And it's an interesting community. And as I say, the other branch of it is the sanguine vampires who do in fact drink blood of various kinds, including human, which they ideally get by consent. There was a show years ago called, I believe, Madhouse. And some of you may remember this. It featured a number of alternative communities, quote unquote, and included a voodoo high priestess, a Wiccan high priestess in the form of Fiona Horn, and a vampire, among other people. And and this was a sanguine vampire. It was a very interesting program. I'm sure you can find parts of it online. But this is an actual living community of people who are certainly not raised from the dead, at least not that I've met, um, but they are very much part of this mythos. And this mythos is very much part of their lives. And that's an important thing to be aware of. One of the big events in Salem was the annual Vampire Ball. And it was quite the event. And I was going to tell, I will tell briefly the story of Coolro the Clown under the heading of What Is It That Frightens a Vampire? And one year in Salem, Sir Edward, who's often in our chat room, went to the Vampire Ball in his persona as Coolro the Vampire Clown. And it's a wonderful costume. There should be photos and video online, certainly in our morgue at Corellian/Magic TV. And Coolro completely freaked out a room full of vampires. So if you ever have to wonder which is more frightening, a vampire or a clown, the answer is a clown. And if you put the two of them together, it's pretty remarkable. And hello to Antonio in the chat room. I may have already said hello to Antonio, but Antonio says the TV show What We Do in the Shadows has a comedic take on this that includes psychic vampirism and emotional vampirism as well. I understand this is actually quite an insightful program. And yes, these are all forms of vampirism. And if we had another half hour to go into this, and perhaps we'll take another half hour sometime soon, we could talk about the differences between sanguine vampirism, psychic vampirism, and emotional vampirism, both intentional on the part of people who identify this way and unintentional, because psychic vampirism and emotional vampirism are things that a lot of people do unintentionally because they are lacking, well, as Michel Belanger says, lacking yang energy and have an excess of yin energy. And they must consume that yang energy from outside. One of the things I talk about frequently is how we're constantly putting off energy as living beings and taking in energy. Um, And vampirism, as I understand it, in this natural sense, separate from the mythology of vampires, but in the sense that there are actual psychic and emotional vampires, they're getting this, they're getting the yang energy that they have a deficit in their natural formation from these sources. And in the end, that's all it is. And also the ideal way to handle it, because this can actually be very useful. That was the thing that Michel Belanger taught me that really changed my mind about this, because she pointed out that in many forms of psychic healing, to have an excess of the yin energy and a deficit of the yang can actually be very helpful. Those that involve pulling out energy as part of the healing, for example. And that was a revelation to me. Um, and Perhaps the most profound thing we're going to say about vampires today. With that, I have to say we've reached the end of our half hour. I hope you've enjoyed the program. Tomorrow, we will have Chris Copeland as our guest host talking about the latest things at Corellian Publishing, and I hope you will tune in for that. There may be quite some exciting news. And I'll be back on Thursday talking about zombies. And as with my previous entries on zombies, it's not particularly my intention to talk about the science fiction trope of zombies, but the metaphysical history of the idea of zombies. But we'll see where it goes. I hope you'll join me then. And of course, on Friday, we will have our weekly roundup of stories, and there may be some interesting ones this week. So thank you for joining me. I hope that you have enjoyed it. I have enjoyed it. And let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to help us to go forward with open minds and open hearts in life, and to learn all that we can learn and understand all that we can understand. Help us to know that there is more in life than most of us generally conceive, and help us to being open to understanding that. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and great respect. And from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always.